Few tears were shed in grief upon the death of Louis XVI. As far as any revolutionary was concerned, the moment the tyrant's blood-soaked head was hoisted high for all to see marked the end of monarchy in France. The Ancien regime, Bourbon absolutism, the tyranny of the nobility. All of it was washed away, gone for good. Thus, the trial and execution of Louis was not a turning point, but rather a point of no return. There was no going back to the dark days before the Republic. All that was left was to forge a path onwards. And here, in January of 1793, we've got two different threads to unravel. The first revolves around Paris politics, how the convention handles the fallout of regicide, its own internal divisions between the Girondins and Montagnard, and a royalist uprising in the modern day. Then there's the military side of things, the armies of the Republic advancing on all fronts, scoring unexpected victories, the war feeding itself. To keep things neat and tidy, and to keep me from having to cut back and forth from Paris to the front, I'll focus this episode on the military situation, returning to Paris for the political situation next episode. So where we last left off, General Kellermann, having joined Dumouriez's Army du Nord, won a minor tactical victory at Valmy against the Austro-Prussian army under the Duke of Brunswick, a minor victory with gargantuan strategic consequences. Well, that was all the way back in September, and we then left Kellermann and Dumouriez in the field. Valmy was not an isolated event, however. The reversals of the early months of the war had been avenged, and France was on the attack. Further defeats were inflicted upon the foreign armies which had invaded, and now, in the latter months of 1792, the French took to this strategic offense. The Armée des Vosges, under General Adam-Philippe Custine, invaded Germany, and the Armée du Var, under General Jacques d'Anselme, invaded Italy. Both campaigns went exceptionally well. Now, the armies that were holding the forts, routing the enemy, and winning the battles were a new breed of fighting force never before seen on the battlefields of Europe. And it was the famous levée en masse which supplied the Republic's armies with the manpower, fodder, weapons and munitions they would need, as well as imbuing them all with an unsurpassable esprit de corps. So it's well worth taking a deep dive into the armies of the First Republic. And I want to state clearly from the get-go that the systems of organisation, modes of replenishment, strategies and tactics used by the army are not merely of value for military reasons. They had far-reaching effects. Simply put, France was fighting for its survival. The overriding aim of winning the war necessitated the National Convention promulgate laws that were increasingly invasive and increasingly uncompromising. Laws that called upon the productivity, passions and manpower of the entire nation, man, woman and child. The exigencies of war indelibly marked the fabric of French politics, and thereby French society. The best place to start with our survey of French arms is not with the Army of the Republic, but rather with the Army of the Kingdom that preceded it, the Royal Army of the Kingdom of France. The core of the Royal Army was formed during the reign of Louis XIV. When the Sun King ascended the throne, he also inherited the army. Like all contemporary European armies, it left much to be desired. This is because there were effectively two types of armies in French service. The unprofessional army, consisting of ill-fed and ill-disciplined militias, they're mostly to defend the borders or to be called up in times of desperation. And then there was the smaller main corps, the professional army consisting of well-drilled and comparatively well-paid regulars. Both relied upon extensive conscription to maintain manpower, though to be sure, even as early as the 17th century, military thinkers were extolling the virtues of an all-volunteer force, solely dedicated to the undertaking of war, but of course this was still a pipe dream. At this time France had maybe 70,000 troops, split among these two forces. Manpower shortages were made up with the use of mercenaries. Now the general trend in Europe during the 1600s had been to shift away from the loose, unprofessional model towards a far more professional model. A shift that simultaneously caused and was caused by the rapid expansion and modernization of the art of administration, which also occurred during the 17th century. We could dwell on this for a while, I won't. It suffices to say that Louis XIV's aggressive foreign policy saw France almost constantly fighting someone. Thus Louis lent heavily upon his army. It was only logical to invest the time and effort, and most importantly the money, required to improve the army. So the army benefited mightily from several decades of centralization, modernization and expansion until it emerged into the 18th century as the paramount European land army. Now there's two big takeaways from this. Number one, France knew that its army was the best, and so the professional French army was imbued with an incredible esprit de corps. And two, the aristocracy was effectively inseparable from the army as an institution. Officers were aristocrats, and aristocrats were officers. Alright, so for pretty well all of the 73 years Louis XIV reigned, his armies were out there campaigning, whether it be in the forests of Canada, the bayous of Louisiana, the forests of Germany, polders of Holland, the islands of the Caribbean, or the plains of Italy. Their record was generally quite good. They suffered no small number of nasty defeats, but also enjoyed plenty of resounding victories. Unfortunately for the kingdom, Louis's excellent army didn't survive him. Louis XV, his successor, presided over a few decades of marked decline in French prestige. For the first few decades, the army performed to its usual high standards. Enough seasoned officers, veteran soldiers, and that oh so essential esprit de corps carried over. That was up to and until the Battle of Fontenoy. Fontenoy was then, and is now, regarded as a triumph for French arms, but it was to prove the high watermark of the French army until, well, a certain Corsican was made a general. More on him down the road. The army soon stagnated, and then declined, not so much out of any active harm inflicted by Louis, it was more a kind of deliberate neglect. Career officers were made to retire or died off, replaced by the talentless dregs of the noblesse d'épée and the noblesse de corps. These sops won their appointments not by proving their military acumen, but merely by holding more sway at court, and this usually meant sucking up to the king's then mistress, either the Madame du Pompadour or the Madame du Barry. The rot that had set in at the highest levels of leadership seeped down into the ranks. Amongst both the officers and the men, esprit de corps evaporated. Cuts to the budget left troops with old equipment. Even at the best of times, food was awful, but it was at least reliable. By the mid-18th century, it was both crap and inconstant. The men faked, or did genuinely suffer from, all manner of maladies, and whiled away their service in the hospitals already overflowing with sick and wounded. Perhaps most damning of all was the habit of officers to inflate the numbers of recruits in official reports, pocketing the wages that were meant for their ghost battalions. Corruption of this sort was endemic. It was, and in some of today's armies still is, a major problem. On the topic of wages, these were cut drastically, meaning that soldiers either had to resort to taking day jobs to make ends meet, or, when on campaign, looting and plundering anything that wasn't too heavy to carry. It'd be fair to say that regular pay is the basis of good discipline. Well, without regular pay, French discipline was non-existent out of the better provided for elite units. The ghost battalion phenomenon also had another dire consequence. The army's reported strength was always much, much higher than its real strength. This decline in both prestige and prowess was well understood at the time. The few professional officers there were lamented the state of the army, warning that if the situation was not soon rectified, the next war would be a disaster. And they were absolutely right. All their predictions came to pass in 1756 with the outbreak of the 7 Years' War. In Europe, the mainstay of the Royal Army was both under strength and generally poorly led. At the hands of the Prussians, they suffered an unexpected defeat at Rossbach early on, a defeat from which the French hoped to swiftly recover and avenge, as they had done for the last 100 years. But they didn't recover, nor could they avenge Rossbach. At every turn, the Prussians and the British thwarted the French in Europe. It wasn't until the final years of the war in Europe that the French started to do okay, a product I would say not of lessons learned, but rather pure combat experience, making Royal Armies tougher nuts to crack for the then exhausted Prussians. And as we know, things did not bode well for France and her colonies. Despite some successes in India, the French were isolated and forced to surrender. A hemisphere away, the British launched neat campaigns to conquer Canada and Louisiana, and did so by 1759. It was no cakewalk. The British General Louis-Joseph de Montcalm, probably the best French general of the era, did offer stiff resistance, but he was decisively defeated at the Plains of Abraham, a defeat for which France lost her American colonies, and Montcalm lost his life. When we were first covering the 7 Years' War, we dwelled upon the political, diplomatic and economic consequences, less so the military ones. But it's obvious that the shock to the French about the ease with which they had been brushed aside by supposedly inferior armies had a devastating impact upon the Royal Army's reputation. Prussia emerged from the 7 Years' War battered and bruised but unequivocally triumphant, having dethroned the Royal Army as the finest in Europe, with Britain a close run second. Now, while the defeat caused France to double down on its alliance with Austria, the army took a different track and essentially rebuilt itself from scratch. Minister of War Chaussy began a top-to-bottom reform of both the army and the navy. To focus on the army, the whole system of recruitment and procurement was centralised and made a duty of the state rather than kept the purview of individual officers. This rationalised the equipping and provisioning of the army. These functions were given over to a new official army post, that of quartermaster. Quartermasters were generally given the money needed for supplying and recruiting troops, putting an end to the corruption of greedy officers. Furthermore, the ministry reorganised the militia, reformed the military police, and founded a veterinary school. It was also around this time that Gribeauval pioneered modern artillery production and tactics. He was supported in this endeavour by Chaussy's successor, the Comte de Saint-Germain. The Comte continued general reform by ceasing the sale of officer commissions, reorganising the army's medical service, and forming 10 new provincial military academies. And that'd be the second reference to a certain Corsican, because as a boy Napoleone Bonaparte would attend one of these schools at Brienne. Saint-Germain was only at the gig a few years, his stint cut short by the controversy he generated over the thinning of the ranks of the Maison de Roye, but also over his new Prussian-style corporal punishments introduced to buck up French discipline. It had been the case that French discipline was, by the standards of the day, not quite so brutal. discipline was born of esprit de corps, and when that wasn't enough, lashings or administrative punishments. In 1776, Saint-Germain would take the Prussian practice of beating the shit out of someone with the flat side of a sword and try and apply that to the Royal Army. Culture shock doesn't do it justice. Even the officers were dismayed, thinking it was far too severe. Funnily enough, this was one of the gentler punishments devised by the Yonkers out east. Before the French entered into the American War of Independence, there was still a great deal of seesawing about which direction the Royal Army should go. While some military thinkers dreamt of an all-volunteer army, an officer of the Noblesse d'Épée went one step further. The Comte de Guibert published anonymously in his 1772 magnum opus the Essay on General Tactics. He need not have hidden his name. The book was a sensation, quickly translated and disseminated throughout Europe. Guibert's essay was based upon his experiences as an observer to many of the armies of Europe, namely the Prussian army. The controversial core was his belief that a patriotic mass army should replace the Royal Army. His ideal was an army that married patriotism and esprit de corps. The essay on general tactics caused quite a stir in France, but the recent humiliations of the 7 Years' War had done enough damage to French pride to convince many senior officers that such radical reforms as proposed by Guibert might be necessary. Saint-Germain certainly thought so and made sure that Guibert was elevated, later being made a lecturer at the Académie Française in 1786. In hindsight, it's plain that Guibert was ahead of his time, predicting Carnot's Armée de Masse of 1793. For now, however, more measured appraisal of the Essay on General Tactics inculcated a reformist streak in many senior officers. One such officer was Joseph Servin. In 1780 he published an essay called The Citizen Soldier and codified the concept. He rejected that an army of mass was needed, but agreed with Guibert that systemic reforms were vital, particularly as regarded the quality and training of new recruits. Moreover, he supposed that the soldier had to be elevated socially. Remember, soldiers of the 18th century were not held in high regard. Servin argued that a soldier integrated into society as a necessary component of the kingdom was one that would fight tooth and nail for its preservation. A very prescient argument. Servin would go on to serve as Minister of War in early 1792, before being replaced by Dumouriez. After Dumouriez was given a field command, Servin resumed his old post and oversaw major reforms to the army in its trial by fire. This reformed and revitalized Royal Army got a chance to avenge the humiliations of the 7 Years' War in 1777, with the French intervention into the American War of Independence. The expeditionary force led by the Comte de Rochambeau was the best French army put to the field for 50 years. They had a number of experienced officers and well-educated younger officers like the Marquis de Lafayette, who proved just how fruitful it had been to invest in military academies and schools. The troops were well paid, supplied and fed. Their artillery was vastly superior to that the British possessed. Battle plans were detailed and precise. Record-keeping was excellent. Of course, things weren't all sunshine and roses. The French kind of stumbled out the gate and took a while to get into a rhythm, but once they did, it was all over for the Brits. The Royal Army took the lead in numerous sieges, most crucially the Siege of Yorktown, that all but guaranteed American independence. Smaller forces in the Caribbean were likewise quite successful. The Royal Army benefited mightily from heavy investment in the Navy, which, like the Army, avenged its defeats of the 7 Years' War, achieving at the very least parity in American waters with the vaunted Royal Navy. All in all, not a bad little war. Well, that's if you weren't in the Ministry of Finance. Several French military strategists and thinkers came to the fore at this time, and this included Servin and Guibert. Likewise, hero of the 7 Years' War Marshal Broglie was allowed to implement various reforms to infantry tactics, which were then tested in well-executed trial maneuvers. Of course, the brilliant organizer of victory, Lazare Carnot, pioneered military science at this time, expanding upon the work of Gribeauval. Indeed, the success of Gribeauval's reforms prompted a revolution in ideas on the proper use of artillery. The brothers de Taille penned treatises emphasizing the need to deploy artillery en masse at a single critical point, and then to coordinate with the infantry. Their teachings were very influential on a young Bonaparte. But the most important and most enduring development made at this time was the formation of a modern general staff, the first of its kind. The Marquis de Ségur had talented military theorist Pierre Bosset form a council of war to be staffed by the best and brightest senior officers. In times of peace, they drafted plans of deployment and mobilization, as well as maintain the readiness of the army. In times of war, the Council of War would serve as the nucleus of all strategic decisions, a centralized system of command and control still in place today. Now, all of these reforms were fine and dandy, but were often too little, too late, to really fix the endemic issues that faced the army. John Elting, the author of the book from which I'm getting most of this information, summed it up pretty nicely. Their best efforts merely plastered over the cracks in an army that, like the French nation, was collapsing from within. Mostly, these problems stem from interferences from Louis XVI, or the machinations of the nobles. Louis was always far more interested in the condition of the navy. So when nobles, their positions threatened by reforms that prioritised competence over connections, whispered in the king's ear, Louis oftentimes blindly subscribed to their proposals. For instance, Pierre Bosset, architect of the Council of War, required that the corps of officers considered for position on the council possessed a distinguished staff college education and submit to a period of probation. Well, to wreck this system, Louis blithely followed advice from Minister Ségur and implemented a decree which forbade any officer from holding military positions unless they were the latest of at least 4 generations of nobility. This completely wiped out the eligibility of all the up-and-coming talented officers. Furthermore, to ensure that pedigree and not performance determined who held military positions, Louis had final say on up to half of all officer promotions and appointments. Adding to the Royal Army's problems was that by design, it was quite top-heavy. Basically, new officer positions were created every few years to accommodate the growing number of young nobles who sought gainful employment in the army. It was necessary to create new positions instead of simply replacing the existing officers because, well, the incumbent officers, mostly senior officers from prestigious families, held a lot of sway and more often than not kept their commissions for life. Now, this practice was a lifeline for incoming young officers. Even lads of decent means found the life of an officer to be expensive. They lived in a constant cycle of debt, thus by necessity becoming ambitious for promotion to rescue their finances. So ambitious were they that the officer class regularly rallied to block the inclusion of non-nobles into their ranks, as this threatened all their livelihoods. At the outbreak of the Revolution, the kingdom had 9,728 active officers, of whom 6,333 were nobles. Less than 1,000 were of common origin, and the rest were a split of mercenaries or foreign officers. But the roles of active officers paled in comparison to the roles of inactive officers. Those retired from service, undergoing education, prospective new officers, foreigners in temporary service, and all those invalided or suspended from service. Usually they sat at half pay, but that was still a shitload of money to be spending on guys who, at the end of the day, weren't doing anything productive. So the Royal Army had too few active officers and too many inactive officers. All of them vying for a shrinking pool of money whilst France was forced to slash army funds as it was in the grips of a prolonged economic crisis. Yeah, not ideal. The 180,000 plus troops weren't too happy either. Conditions for the enlisted blokes were just as deplorable. 2 or 3 to a single bunk, less pay, new equipment being paid for out of pocket, and horse feed for meals. They were also very put upon by the surplus of officers. The officers themselves were not the creme de la creme. Again, truly talented up-and-comers like a young Napoleon were those who slipped through the cracks. In the main, officers neglected their duties, happy to take pay and social status that came with a commission, but not actually perform their duty. Other officers skewed to the extreme end. They maintained strict discipline, even in this time of peace, aping the Prussians in their liberal application of corporal punishment. Elting describes 3 main shortcomings in the Royal Army. They had no reliable source of new recruits, and merely took whoever they could. That trust between officers and enlisted men was non-existent, and either way officers were forced to devote much of their time and attention to army politics. And lastly, that there was really nothing to inspire the army. It was this army that the National Assembly inherited in 1789. At this time, the Royal Army consisted of 113,000 infantrymen, 32,000 cavalrymen, and 10,000 artillerymen. There was also a contingent of 75,000 militia that bucked up the army's regular numbers. Though attempts had been made to fully disband the milice, they'd proven too useful to get rid of, as the regular army hemorrhaged over 3,000 men per year, which meant the militia had to fill in the gaps. Additionally, France had around 7,000 soldiers in the Maison du Roi, elite troops in the king's personal service. Included were the Swiss Guards, and though troops of the Maison did guard royal interests, theirs was a largely ceremonial duty. They were not by and large frontline combat units. Sweeping changes were being made all across France by the National Assembly. This was all during that period of rationalization and centralization, and the army was not omitted. The necessity of army reforms was recognized early, but the Assembly had no legal mechanism by which to impose changes on the king's army. In a very real sense, the army was Louis's, and until the constitution was well on the way, completely off limits to the revolutionaries. The sticking point did not sit well. In 1790, the Assembly did vote to assume some decision-making control over executive affairs, and this included the army. Now, the cautious incremental reform of the Ancien regime would be overshadowed by the rapid-fire changes wrought by revolution. So the Assembly now did what it always did when faced with a problem, formed a small committee. The 2 most important figures in this Comité Militaire were the Comte Mirabeau and Edmond Dubois-Crozet. Idealistic Mirabeau would aim to revitalize the army into a revolutionary, politicized force. As a former officer, Dubois-Croncet would temper these aims with more pragmatic concerns, though to be sure he was still very much ideologically motivated. Together, their aim was not merely to rationalize the army, it was also to create a national army, a politically reliable army committed to the revolution, and ready to defend the whole nation should the need arise. Both Mirabeau and Dubois-Croncet were in agreement that the army had to be disentangled from the king. All regiments of the army were therefore to be homogenized, partly with an eye to rationalize procurement, but also to get rid of royal regiments. Of the Royal Army's 102 line battalions, 23 had been of foreign origin, formed mostly by French allies in the Rhineland and Switzerland, meaning that several battalions were German. Because all royal battalions were heavily particularized and regional, recruiting from and identifying with a given region, the fear among many reformers was that these strong bonds might undermine loyalty to the revolution. In fact, these ties were sometimes so strong that many battalions were only partly loyal to the king. They were loyal first and foremost to their noble patrons and home regions. The National Assembly started the ball rolling on homogenizing these regiments. Gone were the royal regiments or elite foreign regiments, and all the old white uniforms too. In this manner, all army regiments were reverted to an older, outdated model of organization, but this allowed them to be standardized. By 1791, regional appellations were stripped and unique uniforms done away with. For instance, the Royal de Pont Regiment became the 99th Regiment of the Line, replete in fine blue coats. The Royal Roussillon Regiment became the 59th Regiment of the Line, etc., etc. Symbolic changes like these only partially improved the army in any meaningful military sense. The real point of most of these changes was to incorporate the army into the revolutionary body politique, to disentangle it from the king. Moreover, this was an army that better reflected the society it was there to defend, united in aim, drawn from the entire nation. Dubois-Croncet moved for wholesale reform to the army's recruitment process so as to cut down on desertion, corruption, and inefficiencies. Mirabeau saw political merit in such reforms. Not only would yet more of the ancien regime be demolished, but he hoped that a more egalitarian recruiting process might produce Servan's citizen soldier. As it was, the regular army recruited by way of roving bands of recruiter sergeants who would promise basically anything to get gullible young peasant boys to sign up for service. Service terms were increased from 3 years to 6, and apart from a hefty initial bounty, paid very little, a little bit over 7 sous per day. Moreover, a soldier's equipment and food were not provided by the army. Desperate for more money, some even deserted their regiments to join up with other regiments, all for that hefty initial bounty, in a process called billardage. The kind of guys recruited were invariably of a type, either poor peasant boys from the countryside, or thieves, criminals, and vagrants. Scum of the earth in the estimation of contemporary writers, and most importantly, their officers. Relatively few urban peasants joined the army, as they were comparatively comfortable, and didn't have to worry about harvest season. This led to a divide between the army and the people it was meant to protect. Inflaming the situation was the tendency for armies to be billeted in local towns and cities, displacing residents for weeks at a time. Wholesale reforms to the recruiting process had to address all these problems. There was great enthusiasm for such reforms, not only from civilians, but also army officers. Many officers had read Guibert and Servan, and believed that the class distinctions of French society, which were likewise present in the army, served only to undermine cohesion. Their proposals were to switch over to an all-volunteer service, a whole step beyond Dubois-Croncet's proposal for universal conscription. Only partial reforms were made to the recruitment process before 1792, after which the Republic took over and really pushed hard for an egalitarian process, and we'll go over that later on. For now though, while France was still at peace, the Assembly was willing to rest upon their laurels a bit, expecting that an all-volunteer service would be possible because, of course, the citizens would flock to the colours, eager to serve the patrie and the revolution. But more pragmatic sorts prevailed upon the Assembly the need to make service more bearable. The volunteers would have to want to fight after all. This meant not simply making conditions and wages and terms of service better for regular troops, but also elevating their social status. Frequent mutinies and even full-scale desertions of entire units drove this point home. You may recall the Great Fear when chaos swept across France, while mostly in the south army mutinies became common occurrences. Not only were the troops peeved about unbearable conditions, but they also despised their hated officers. Many were lynched during the Great Fear. The Assembly tried to get a handle on things by addressing one of the main complaints made by soldiers. Why the hell is my pay late, and why is there only half? Soldiers were asked to submit accounts for missing or late pay. But while the Assembly, in an earnest attempt to fix this mess, took the time needed to sort out pay discrepancies, the soldiers continued to mutiny. Few regiments remained loyal, much less intact. It took the Assembly reluctantly granting tacit active citizen status upon soldiers, like that enjoyed by the National Guard, to quieten down the riotous troops. Taking the Assembly up on the offer, the soldiers joined political clubs, absorbed revolutionary propaganda, and in general participated in the political process, daring anyone to stop them. With no capacity to actually stop them, the Assembly officially permitted the troops to join political clubs in May of 1791. By July, they also formally extended active status to serving troops in their local areas. The property requirements were waived. They only had to be 25 years or older. The Assembly also made genuine attempts to improve the soldiers' lot in life, with better pay and provisions. They were also no longer subject exclusively to military law. The rights of man and the citizen would naturally include soldiers. Corporal punishment was out, and troops were no longer subject to arbitrary punishment by their officers. Not only did these changes ingratiate the soldiers to the Assembly, but they also disempowered the politically unreliable officers of the Old Guard. Of course, many of the Old Guard protested, and even some soldiers too. They claimed that this was the death of discipline in the French army. But again, the soldiers were active in politics now, and had public opinion on their side. Thus a compromise was achieved, and a distinction would be made between civil offences and military offences. Such reforms did not go unappreciated by the soldiers, and they respected the Assembly's acknowledgement of their dignity and newfound status. And indeed the effects of all these myriad reforms was to elevate the social status of the soldiers. The benefits enjoyed by a soldier attracted young men to service, and thus drew in a far more representative portion of the population, not merely the extremely poor and desperate as it had been. As part of these changes in organisation, new units were raised. The Chasseurs Epides, which would render such distinguished service for the Republic and later the Empire, were officially formed. So too was the Horse Artillery on instruction from the Marquis de Lafayette. Quite deliberately, the benefits of these reforms were both military and political. Beyond merely improving the army, the renewed army reflected a front fundamentally changed by years of revolution. Egalitarian, rationalised, and steeped in patriotic fervour. So the National Assembly basically had the troops on side. But what about the officers? Held aloft from both the Assembly and the common troops, officers were deemed politically unreliable and supremely dangerous. Much like with the reforms for the rank and file, the Comité Militaire focused on enforcing equality and uniformity upon the officer corps. Equality meant that efforts at democratization were undertaken. For example, a select number of NCOs were allowed to be promoted to the rank of sous-lieutenant in reward for long or exceptional service, and this brought ambitious commoners into the ranks of the officer corps. This also meant that Louis' decree on the proof of nobility was done away with. And just so you're aware, these are the officers who will go on to serve in the armies of the French Empire, commoners of incredible talent finally given the chance to prove their mettle. Uniformity meant that officers were now subject to the same laws and expectations as common soldiers. Professionalism and loyalty were valued above all other traits. Problem was that these cultural changes would only really start to take effect with subsequent generations of officers, and the vast majority of officers were of noble birth, and rightly distrusted by the Assembly. Clearing house and replacing most of these unreliable officers would be disastrous. Not only would it likely trigger a mutiny, but it would sap France of nearly all of its veteran strategists and tacticians. Instead, the decision was made to gradually replace the Old Guard officers with younger, reliable officers coming up through the military academies. The pace of this changing of the Guard was hotly contested. Some feared that a noble revolt was imminent and wanted the officer corps thoroughly purged. Others sought to combine the experience of the Old Guard with the reliability of the new. Given enough time, things might have worked out, but unfortunately the Assembly failed to invest in expanding their military academies, and as a result, too few new officers were replacing the Old Guard. This forced the Assembly, and later on the Convention, to continue to rely heavily upon the Old Guard, and that would prove to be a mistake. By 1792, the Comité Militaire had made some pretty extensive reforms to the Royal Army. These changes had come in fits and starts, caution sometimes overriding expedience, but overall the effects were quite positive. But there was one big side effect. They had essentially bifurcated the army, two different armies led by two different types of officer. Okay, but what does that actually mean? Well, the Comité Militaire had studiously followed Guibbert's maxim from his essay on general tactics, that every soldier is a citizen and every citizen a soldier. The National Army, consisting of citizen soldiers, was politically reliable, and the main reason for this was volunteer recruitment. While an all-volunteer army was fine in theory, it did have a practical limitation. Conventional wisdom held that a volunteer army could not achieve the same levels of discipline as a typical conscript force. Even if it could, that would take a long time to achieve, And the Assembly's various attempts to improve conditions by, for example, abolishing corporeal punishment and disempowering officers meant that conventional means of instilling discipline, by strict and unwavering punishment even for minor infractions, well, that was no longer possible. But here's the really big part: that was only half true. All the Assembly's reforms were applied unevenly across the army. Brand new battalions and existing French battalions were homogenized quite nicely into the all-volunteer system, and the milice was disbanded, so they're not a problem. But older royal regiments were not so easily integrated. Their officers and even some veteran soldiers were resistant to any reforms. And the Assembly, not wanting to risk a revolt, didn't really press the issue too hard. A whole section of the army maintained Ancien Regime era organization and discipline. They were paid less, persisted under worse conditions, had crappy contracts, and even wore old uniforms. They were, however, rock-ribbed veterans of the old army, professionals in every sense. So the divide within the army was between the professional soldier and the volunteer soldier. The Assembly was well aware of this disparity, and naturally favoured the politically reliable volunteer over the professional soldier. In fact, while the Assembly wanted professional officers, they deliberately attempted to discourage a high level of professionalism among the rank and file. Their fear was that a French Caesar might seize upon the pride of such troops to overthrow the revolution, which is something that's kind of going to happen in 1793, and we'll get to that shortly. Volunteers and professionals had a tense relationship. Sometimes white and blue clashed violently. Volunteers dismissively referred to the professionals as coeur blanc, and were offended by their perceived lack of patriotism and revolutionary zeal. The professionals bit back, pissed off at the better pay enjoyed by inferior troops. It would take a literal war for these two armies to fuse, and earn in each other a begrudging mutual respect. Within the officer corps, the divide was not between professionals and volunteers, but the more familiar divide between commoner and noble. We've already been over this in pretty good detail, but the main takeaway is that most of the officer corps was completely untrustworthy. Actively did many noble officers scheme and connive. As the Assembly steadily reformed the Royal Army, these old guard officers relied upon for station and wealth. Thus, the crux of the problem was of loyalty. Most officers were split between serving the king, to whom they professed loyalty, or a revolutionary government they also, at least conditionally, were expected to be loyal to. Well, we know how this one went. A vast majority of noble officers defected or retired in the aftermath of the flight to Varennes, most of them ending up in the army of the Prince of Condé. Over the years, some officers attempted to defect with entire units, or even offer their services to the counter-revolution. Best example of this was General Bullier, who gained the support of several dissentious German units to join Louis after his escape from Paris. Most officers who fled were blue-blooded noblemen from the cavalry or infantry. It got so bad that at one point the army's senior colonel was still a teenager. That colonel was the Duc de Chartres, the son of Philippe Égalité and the future King Louis-Philippe I. Proportionally fewer fled from the artillery, where the officers were generally younger, trained in military science, and drawn from the middle class. The fact that so many of them remained was of great utility to the Republic. By mid-1791, the fires of war had begun to burn, the flames fanned by the hawkish rhetoric of the politically ascendant Girondins. Thus, with war looming, the Legislative Assembly went to great lengths to prepare the nation. Recruitment for the disintegrating Royal Army was at the centre of the project. You'll recall the Fête de la Fédération of 1791, which was intentionally set up to be one great big recruiting drive. And it was a wonderful success, at least for the first few weeks. The Assembly was still insistent upon gaining volunteers, not conscripts, but not enough men were volunteering. Patriotism and revolutionary fervour were enough to get a man out in the streets, but to actually take the plunge, pick up arms, and commit to the often short, always miserable life of a soldier, for most this was too much to ask. The Assembly stepped things up with a nationwide recruitment drive, replete with propaganda, patriotic invocations, and added incentives. Each department was asked to furnish 4 battalions each, ideally with their men fully equipped. New recruits were actually required to pay for their own equipment, a musket, boots, and a blue uniform. This was basically impossible, so the community would pool the funds to equip their recruits. Though, as you might expect, many still couldn't get the muskets or boots, and only ended up wearing a thick, dyed blue coat. In a clean break with the Royal Army, most officers were elected. Generally, the electable officers were pre-selected by the departments. But more than a few were very popular in their own right, and ingratiated themselves to the men to earn their appointment. Bad leaders slipped through the cracks, of course, but in the main the majority of officers were both competent and well liked. Now this haphazard and decentralised means of recruitment did take the pressure off the Assembly, but that meant that the whole process progressed at a snail's pace. Only 83 understrength battalions, less than half of what was hoped for, were formed by year's end, and even then they were not properly equipped or trained. But progress things did, and by the outbreak of war in April, France had around 75,000 new recruits under arms, formed into 169 battalions. Now, while these troops were very well motivated, their spirits soaring on wings of patriotism, their training was lacking, and most were under-equipped. Knowing full well that these troops, no matter how confident, were simply not enough to win the war, the Legislative Assembly demanded another 45 battalions. This decision was made in part because the regular army units, those that through thick and thin had remained loyal, or if not loyal at least intact, were severely under strength. The old corps of the Royal Army couldn't win the war on their own. The burden would have to fall to the volunteers of the new Revolutionary Army. Barely had this second recruitment campaign begun when the French invaded the Austrian Netherlands. And we know what a shit show that was. Barely had a shot been fired and the French volunteers bolted back across the border. Even in spite of their efforts, the failure put into stark relief just how unprepared France was for war. So in desperation, and with their armies tumbling back, the Assembly promulgated the law of the country in danger. The law gave the Assembly broad emergency powers to do whatever they deemed necessary to winning the war. We've already seen how the politics of all this shook out. To focus on the military side of things, Dumouriez and Lafayette set about rectifying the situation by reorganizing their infantry brigades. Regular units and volunteers would be incorporated into the same brigades, 1 battalion of regulars for 2 of volunteers. Despite cultural incompatibility, the white-cloaked regulars detested the better-paid and wild-eyed volunteers. The overall effect was to imbue the Revolution's infantry brigades with the verve of the volunteers and the nerve of the regulars. Dumouriez and Kellermann were the first to experience the benefits of this reorganization. With the Duke of Brunswick in France and menacing Paris, the armies of the north and centre converged in the Duke's rear lines. At Vimy, Kellermann delivered his minor, yet decisive, little victory. And that pretty much brings us up to date. So what happened after Vimy? Well, with the army of the Duke of Brunswick racing back east, to the relative safety of the Netherlands, Dumouriez and Kellermann set off in hot pursuit. As the Duke retreated, his troops deserted and continued to suffer from the effects of disease and privation, while the French weren't content to merely let the marauding Austro-Prussians escape. While Kellermann split off to launch an attack into Mainz, Dumouriez relieved the siege of Lille and then plunged into the Austrian Netherlands. The governor of the Austrian Netherlands, the Duke of Saxe-Teschen, hastily assembled a defence. He centred this defence upon a ridgeline near the village of Jemappes. This excellent defensive position overlooked flatlands bracketed by wide rivers. Arrayed on the high ground were dozens of cannon and a corps of around 20,000 hardened Austrian regulars. Breaking the Austrians was going to take some doing. Dumouriez had at his disposal around 40,000 troops, of whom a few thousand were cavalry. Like the Duke, he also had plenty of cannon, but not only was the French cannon more numerous than that of the Austrians, but was now proven to be much better. Reinforcing Dumouriez was a small force of a few thousand men liberated from Lille, led by Louis-Auguste de Harville. Lille itself had been under siege since the Austrian invasion, and it held out on its own for months. And it's a miracle they did so, under constant bombardment, suffering from disease and a lack of supplies. Vimy changed the Austrian calculus, and they broke off the siege to reinforce their defences in the Netherlands, hence why Harville and his cavalry could link up with Dumouriez. Through the early morning fog of November 6th, Dumouriez sized up his Austrian opponents. Seeing that they were so widely dispersed, he decided to launch a double envelopment. 2 wings would attack headlong up the ridgeline. Dozens of separate attacks were launched throughout the day. The attacks were uncoordinated, but nonetheless effective. Inch by inch, the French pushed back the Austrians and gained more ground. A young Louis-Philippe led his force in a ferocious frontal assault, and under the cover of French artillery, they managed to pierce the Austrian line. For hours, the Austrians tried to contain the French, but fearing that all was lost, Saxe-Teschen sounded the retreat. Harville and his corps, exhausted from the day's fighting, attempted to circumvent the enemy and cut them off. Austrian troops filed across a narrow bridge, their only means of escape. Despite his best efforts, however, Harville could not stop the Austrians. They withdrew largely intact and in good order, although their morale was absolutely shattered. Losses were fairly even for both sides, a few thousand dead and wounded. But like at Vimy, it was the strategic implications that ensured Jemappes was a decisive victory. For starters, it was an unequivocal victory. Dumouriez had defeated a proper, full-strength Austrian field army. Next, it was a demonstration of the offensive spirit of the volunteers. Despite the severity of the battle, they had not quit and fought bravely. And finally, it was an away game win. The French had attacked the Austrians on their home turf and come out on top. Dumouriez followed up Jemappes with a rapid advance on Mons. The city surrendered without a fight. Advancing, he then defeated a minor Austrian counterattack near Brussels before forcing the city to surrender on the 14th. By the end of November, the Austrians were evacuating and Dumouriez was advancing on Antwerp, from where he would swing southeast to Liège. Dumouriez's stunning victories were not isolated. French armies achieved great success in both Italy and Germany. In September, at the same time Dumouriez and Kellermann launched their counter-offensive, Adam Philippe de Custine led the army of the Vosges across the Rhine. City after city fell to his advance. First the city of Speyer after a brief siege, followed by the surrender of Worms and then Philipsburg. Within a month, Custine had taken Mainz. Still uncontested, he advanced, taking Frankfurt am Main. On the Italian front, Jacques d'Anselme made a rapid advance into Savoy, wresting control of the region from the Kingdom of Sardinia-Piedmont. Afterwards, he drove south towards the Mediterranean coast, capturing Nice by the end of September. All told, and by the end of the year, and with a chilly winter setting in, the Republic of France seemed to be in a pretty good strategic position. As compared to the opening months of the war, when enemy armies ranged freely across the eastern departments and Brunswick menaced Paris, now the French were the ones on the offensive, their armies having struck deep into enemy territory. What enabled the French to score such runaway victories was a potent combination of military advantages and deliberate strategy. The revolutionary armies were cohesive, well-led, and highly motivated. Even without proper equipment or training, the mere élan of the French citizen soldier was often enough to carry the day. It also helped that plenty of officers from the Royal Army, and many up-and-coming junior officers, were pretty damn capable and given the opportunity to prove their mettle. Supplying these armies was of course difficult for a cash-strapped national convention, so to ease the burden they winked at a kind of systematized looting widely adopted by the armies. Food, weapons, fodder, money and clothing, whatever the army needed, it took. Furthermore, administrators swooped in to levy heavy taxes on occupied regions. But whilst the looting was widespread and endemic, it was far from the rapine lawlessness typically seen with the invasion of an enemy army. Quite deliberately, the convention had its armies pursue a policy of war in the castles, peace to the villages. Military targets like garrisons, fortifications or citadels were legitimate targets if they chose not to surrender when offered the chance. But villages, towns and cities, if they were peaceable and offered no resistance, could expect to pay stiff taxes or suffer forced requisitions, stuff like that, but that was about it. The local aristocracy, if they'd chosen to linger, were always ousted, giving the middle class a chance to govern, and these guys were decidedly more liberal than their former masters. Many regions even became quite partial to the French. Many in Belgium, for instance, fondly remembered the occupation and pined for integration with France during their War of Independence in 1830. This decidedly lenient policy was reflected in the convention's assertions that theirs was a war of liberation. In the short term, the common people of occupied areas were populations to be exploited to supply the army. In the long term, though, ideally they would be formed into new revolutionary states, republics, just like France, enemies today, comrades tomorrow. But to realize these dreams, France had to win the war first, and that was far from a certainty. With the campaigns of the year over, and a wild success to boot, the French army settled into winter quarters, supplied off of the requisitions from occupied populations. And having so resoundingly beaten their foes, in Italy, the Rhineland and the Netherlands, volunteers began to file back to France in their droves. They were volunteers after all, few had signed on for the 6-year contracts typical for soldiers in the regular Royal Army. To add to the worry of the armies, they were now deep in enemy territory, their supply lines overextended. Opinion was divided on whether or not to continue with the strategic offensive. And with recent desertions, did they have enough men? Actually, at the strategic level, a 4-month winning streak belied the truly dire nature of the Republic's situation. With the execution of the king in January of 1793, the United Kingdom, Spain and Holland, neighbouring kingdoms that until January had seen fit to let the Austrians and Prussians put the boot into France, well, they were left with no illusions as to just what this revolution was all about. One by one, they removed their ambassadors and severed diplomatic relations. Georges Danton rebuked them. He said, "The kings in alliance try to intimidate us. We hurl at their feet, as a gauge of battle, the French king's head." In Paris, the reaction to the kingdoms of Europe ganging up on poor old France was predictable. Sans-culottes took to the streets, protesting and demonstrating in their tens of thousands. Patriotic and revolutionary zeal, though admirable, could only do so much. The National Convention faced major challenges, any one of which might be this young republic's downfall. At the centre of these problems was invariably money. The assignat's value was plummeting, the result of years of inflation. And yet the convention was forced to continue to spend the assignat as though nothing were wrong. So the value continued to sink and the convention's purchasing power diminished. What little money there was had to be spread across so many mounting expenses. One of these new black holes for money was in coastal defence. With Britain and Spain likely to join the war any day now, preparations had to be made to repel any invasion from the sea or the southern border along the Pyrenees. Some attempt was made to avoid war with Britain. Since early September of 1792, Talleyrand had been in talks with neutrality-obsessed Secretary of State William Grenville. But Talleyrand had been set up to take a fall, distrusted now by his radical friends turned enemies in Paris. That being so, there was still some hope that peace might reign. Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger studiously maintained, even after the Bourbons were overthrown, that war with France was not in Britain's interest. It was actually Dumouriez's success in Belgium that set Britain on the warpath. Since the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, the River Scheldt had been closed to navigation, meaning the once great port city of Antwerp was no longer the commercial rival to London it once had been. Now Dumouriez, in his cultivation of the Belgians, and in keeping with the convention's policy of leniency, had reopened the river. Partly in response, Pitt mobilised the army on December 1st. The execution of Louis only ensured that Britain and France were irreconcilable. Not long after Louis's death, Talleyrand received word that not only had his house in Paris been ransacked, but many of his friends and allies had been killed. He was now a wanted man back in France, and by March all of his estates and incomes were seized by the incoming Republic. Talleyrand would linger on in Britain for a while until the Poms exiled him to America in early 1794. But in the more immediate term, France and Britain were on the verge of war. To add to these strategic woes, there were domestic woes. Now I'll go into detail about these domestic woes next episode, but for now, it suffices to say that the Republic was not only fighting a war abroad, but also a war at home. With conditions for the people worsening by the day, the so-called Enragés took to the streets to preach radical economic redistribution. Elsewhere, the open wound that was the Vendée would continue to bleed. It would only be a few months before the entire region went into open revolt, and a civil war began. In the grips of war further, the convention declared war on Spain, Naples, Britain and Holland in February. The alternative would have been waiting for the inevitable. Within a few days, the French armies on the Rhine and Italy were on the defence, struggling to contain a resurgent Austria and the Piedmontese forces. In the south, the Spanish army crossed the Pyrenees into Roussillon, finding the region's Catalan majority quite welcoming. And back up in Belgium, French forces were struck off balance while mopping up the last holdout cities and forts in the region. The Austrians scored numerous minor victories, and most crucially, invested Mainz. It was the prospect of losing Mainz that caused Dumouriez to abandon his plans to invade Holland and instead recommit to the ousting of the Austrians from Belgium. In late February, Dumouriez laid siege to Breda, while a Venezuelan general, yes, you heard right, a Venezuelan general, named Francisco de Miranda, advanced on Maastricht. Dumouriez took Breda after a week, and even planted a liberty tree in the main square. Miranda, meanwhile, was not a good general, and got his ass beat by the Prussians. Dumouriez moved to assist, but soon received word that a combined Dutch-Austrian army of 40,000 men had outflanked him, and threatened to cut off his rear. This was about as bad as it could get. Desperate, he about-faced to meet the enemy, finding them on March 2nd. The fighting was close and fierce, but pretty generally favoured the coalition. By battle's end, thousands of French soldiers lay dead in ill-advised assaults against ready defenders. Dealt a nasty defeat, Dumouriez was forced to retreat. He and Miranda tried to hold Belgium as the Duke of Coburg attacked from the north and south, threatening to cut them off from France. All the while, Dumouriez doubled down and pled his case to the convention. On March 18th, he launched a final desperate gamble. Near the village of Neerwinden, the French forces failed to dislodge Coburg. In disarray, Dumouriez retreated, Coburg nipping at his heels. And it's here that things get a bit funky. Dumouriez was, as you will remember, an avowed Girondin, a constitutional monarchist. Thus the execution of Louis only a few weeks prior was an act of unconscionable barbarity that shook his faith in the revolutionary cause. Indeed, Dumouriez could have been described as a true believer in the revolution before the king's death. Until March of 1793, it was his earnest intention to install a sympathetic republic in Belgium, one that would help to oust the Austrians and hopefully keep Britain from joining the war. This was back before they declared war. With powerful allies in government, such as Foreign Minister Lebrun, he actually did have the authority to conduct this sort of unilateral diplomacy. But Dumouriez was no starry-eyed idealist, and having long sympathised with the Belgians, had many contacts among their political elite. These were not revolutionaries in the French mould, younger middle-class intelligentsia, brimming with ideas. Dumouriez was in bed with the conservative statist faction. In line with Dumouriez's own thinking, they wanted a republic dominated by the landed elite, and which preserved the role of the Catholic Church. Most of this plan was known to the representatives on mission, and thus the convention, in particular Cambon, who was Dumouriez's staunchest critic. It was revealed to him in December that Dumouriez had made a deal with the Belgian clergy, promising to preserve their independence in exchange for funds to form a native Belgian army. In the vein of Caesar, the convention now suspected Dumouriez would form an independent base of political and military support in Belgium and use it as a springboard to cross the Rubicon, as it were, and invade Paris. Across the Channel, Talleyrand crossed his fingers and hoped his ally Dumouriez would do just that. This couldn't be allowed to happen, so the representatives on mission were given blanket power to reimpose the convention's will. That will being that the Belgian provinces support the war effort and the institutions of tyranny, including the Catholic Church, be completely demolished. Unable to stop the representatives, Dumouriez was finished. Suspected by the convention and no doubt expecting to be recalled to face the music, Dumouriez struck a deal with the devil. On the 23rd of March, he contacted the Austrians. Coburg allowed him and the army to retreat across the border into France, not a shot fired. Other French armies in the area followed suit. The gains of the previous year were completely undone. Sitting in his headquarters in Lille, Dumouriez assessed his options. Appalled at the direction of rising radicalism in Paris, and with his military career no doubt coming to an end with a failed campaign on his record, the general made a fateful choice. He made another deal with the Austrians, entreating them to halt their advance while he led his army away from the border and down into Paris. He had made up his mind. Dumouriez intended to overthrow the convention and end the revolution. But getting the army on side was far from certain. Among the soldiers and even some officers, there had always been a base level of suspicion of Dumouriez, who was after all a Girondin, and thus a monarchist sympathiser. Whilst many senior officers were more moderate in their personal politics, the junior officers and regulars skewed Jacobin. On top of that, while Dumouriez had proven his skill at Jemappes, the more recent memory of his generalship was from the disaster at Neerwinden. Dumouriez didn't have the clout to outright say to his troops, "Hey guys, we're gonna go and overthrow the government now." He couldn't be like Caesar. So he had to lay the groundwork, and that was going to take a while. In this state of limbo, Dumouriez lingered for about a week. In that time, the convention dispatched a 4-man commission led by the new Minister of War, Bernouville. There they would meet with Thomas-Augustin de Gasperin, out inspecting the Army of the North. The commission's job was to determine A. just what the hell had happened to Dumouriez in Belgium, and B. what gave him the authority to quit the campaign and make unilateral deals with the enemy. A third and perhaps more important question, was Dumouriez a traitor? The commission didn't have to wait long to find out. On April 1st, they were arrested and handed over to the Austrians, though Gasperin did evade capture. His hand forced, Dumouriez launched his betrayal early. However, when his orders to march on Paris were handed down, pitifully few of the regular units were on board. The rest, mostly revolutionary volunteers after all, were dismayed. So as Dumouriez scrambled to make further deals with the Austrians and secure the support of his officers and men, it was the volunteers who took to the lead in ruining his plans. In fact, Louis-Nicolas Davout, later to be one of Napoleon's finest generals, led his battalion into open revolt. They attempted to arrest Dumouriez, but the traitor general was slippery. Along with a handful of supporters, including Louis-Philippe, he fled across the border on April 5th, taking refuge with the Austrians. The betrayal and subsequent escape of Dumouriez was only the latest in a growing list of body blows for the Republic. It confirmed the worst suspicions the Montagnards and the sections believed of the Girondins, that they were traitors, royalists, counter-revolutionary conspirators. In hushed conversations held in the halls of the Tuileries, in the nightly debates of the Jacobin Club, in the meetings of the vigilance committees and sectional assemblies, ideas were forming around just what should be done about those damn Girondins. It would take a little while longer for the Jacobins to be fully on board, but the sans-culottes were already there, sharpening their knives, rallying to the sections. To win the war, to save the Republic, the Girondins had to go.